Okay, I'll call the March 4th meeting of the Jericho Planning Commission to order. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for joining us if you're visiting with us today. The agenda for tonight, we'll have time for public comment. We'll review and approve our minutes from February 18th. Then, since it's March and it's after town meeting, the annual procedure is for the Planning Commission to adopt rules of procedure and elect a chair and a clerk. Then the bulk of our time tonight will be continuing work on updating the land use and development bylaws, which we are doing through a grant that we affectionately call the BMG, the Bylaw Modernization Grant. Somebody asked me today what that stood for, so I thought I should say. So we have a few topics there, which Chris has structured for us to have a discussion this evening. And then we'll hear reports from one another and make plans for our next meeting on March 18th. Does anybody need to make any changes to the agenda? Okay, sounds like a plan. So next up on the agenda is public comment. And I will invite anyone to share any comments that you have with the Planning Commission. If you would keep your comments to 3 minutes, and also I would encourage you to use the time to make a comment on an item that is not on tonight's agenda. And the reason for that is because later on, once we're in the midst of the bylaw modernization grant discussion, we've allocated a separate time for public comment. But it's your time and you can use it as you see fit. And I will ask you to limit to 3 minutes if I didn't already say that. Okay. Wayne, please come forward, state your name and share your thoughts.
I'm Wayne Ellis. I've been on a couple of committees in the town here.
Yeah, you can sit at the table right there and join us.
Biblical admonition, you always keep the lowest seats on your ass. People think you're. So I have these pictures and I just wanted to pass them around to you all of different.
Can I hand those out?
Okay. These are those ones and then these ones.
Let me to go around. I'm going back that way anyway, as it turns out.
You can do
Here we
that.
go. This is a-
Take one and pass it down.
Yes.
Different kinds.
Yeah, there's two pictures, two different pictures.
Two different
Two different structures.
Got it. Okay. How many are left?
And I don't think that's on there, so I think I'm okay, right?
Which one do you have?
But my only question is there one of these structures that, or any of these structures that wouldn't fit into the proposals for architectures?
In Riverside or anywhere?
Anywhere.
Would you like to leave these with us? The extras?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. Okay, so for people on the Zoom, Wayne has distributed 2 photographs of looks like pretty local buildings that we can share with you afterward, like SJ, who's on the phone, who's on the Zoom especially. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, so I'm just wondering on size and architecture and all, if we were going, let's start with the village. If we were in the village, would one of or any of those you think not fit with what your plans for architecture should be?
Okay, so since this is your time,
Yeah.
maybe if you could give us all your questions.
Okay.
And then we'll see if we want to answer them right now, or if we'll be answering them in the meeting, or if we'll be answering them off a different time.
Okay, well, I guess my question would be that only one question is that as far as and that's really it, I mean, is there any of these architectures that you don't think would fit into your plans for zoning updates for the town?
Okay. And do you have a particular interest or concern related to the answer to that question?
Yes, that's an excellent question.
Okay,
So the gray one.
this one on the left?
Yes.
Okay, my left.
I would be, pretty depressed if that went up across the street from me. I think I had sent you guys notes that there's a lot of us that, you know, our little houses is where most of our wealth resides. And my sensitivity is that if, someone is allowed to build whatever they want, as in that case, that, you know, housing values could go down. And what is my, you know, what am I thinking of? Well, I'm thinking little, small, 700,000 square foot houses will give us more, tax revenue, as opposed to something like that. The other thing is with the gray houses with the gables in the second picture. I used to walk in that neighborhood. I worked nearby there. And I talked to some people that had retired and moved there. And that was before that red, huge apartment building went in. And so I'm assuming there must have been a different developer that did the houses versus that thing. So I guess that is my point. My main point is that, you know, I grew up low income, so I know all about it. Okay, I had to work like heck to get out of it. And I'm just, my heart is for the people that, you know, have their little $400,000 houses that are in their 60s and looking at, okay, hopefully this can be used to help buy into a retirement where there could be some sort of assisted living. And that's really my motivation.
Okay. Would it be all right with you if we think about what you've posed as questions and concerns when we are talking, especially with David, our consultant, about the changes that we're looking at for the zoning? He's on the Zoom.
Oh, okay.
And is that okay? And whatever
Oh,
we
absolutely.
don't get to, it would be, we'd love to talk with you more
Okay.
about it if we can't get through it all
Yeah.
tonight. Okay.
And I do very much prefer talking face to face.
Yeah.
When you type something
I
to
know.
somebody, you don't have the body language.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, but Chris and I
Yeah.
are, and potentially another member of the planning commission are also available to meet with
Yeah.
you another time.
No, I
But
really-
what you asked are excellent questions, I think, to queue up our conversation for tonight. Because you're asking questions about scale and design and functionality and property values and compatibility. And those things are all the kinds of things that we're wrestling with in some ways, because there's not always a black and white
Yeah.
easy answer.
Mhm.
And so I think this actually will really help us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody else, anybody else online want to offer a comment to the planning commission? Are there any members of the public on the Zoom? Okay.
Can I just say one thing?
Aaron, yes. Hi.
Hey, I just wanted to say if you can send those pictures to Ruth or Angeliki, they could perhaps get them into the recording.
I'll do that.
Okay,
Oh,
thank you.
great.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing them.
Yes.
It really helps to have a visual.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move on to minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes, February 18th?
I will make said motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Heidi. And a second.
I will second.
Chris, thank you. Does anybody have any corrections or clarifications to the minutes? Okay, so we'll vote to approve the minutes. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed to approving the minutes? SJ, I saw a thumbs up. That's an aye. Any abstentions? Okay. Then the next topic is our rules of procedure. Or you're gonna lead us through this?
Oh,
We're so fast, or do you want me to do it?
I was counting on you doing.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so the rules of procedure are organized around these 6 topics. What's the purpose of the commission? How are the rules applied? How are we organized, or what rules apply to us from state statute? How are we organized? How do we do agendas, meetings, and incorporate public participation? And in my mind, the rules of procedure are helpful to make sure, one, that we comply with all the laws that we need to comply with, and 2, that we have consistency and we are fair and we're organized and we have some semblance of knowing what we're doing. So the rules of procedure Chris sent out ahead of time to everyone. He offered some minor edits that were grammatical, which I especially loved, and also ones to update to make sure that we're referencing the correct statutes. So everyone received the rules? Anybody, would someone like to make a motion to accept the rules of procedure for 25-26?
I will make the motion that we accept the rules and procedures for 2025-26.
And a second.
And a second.
Okay, so now that the motion is on the table, learn this better. Do we have any discussion about the rules of procedure to adopt? So does anyone want to make any changes? Does anybody have any questions about it? Are we ready to vote? Yes?
I'm ready to vote.
Okay. All those in favor of approving the rules of procedure, say aye. Aye. SJ says aye. Thank you. Anybody opposed? Okay, no, anybody abstain? Okay, so unanimously, we've adopted our rules of procedure. Our next task is to elect a chair and a clerk. So I think we need somebody to nominate a chair and a clerk. We could do it together, probably. It's a one motion. Look at that. So,
I nominate Susan and Sabina
as,
respectively,
okay,
chair and clerk.
and
I second
a
that.
second. Okay, any discussion?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's nominate you.
Um,
Continue service.
I'm happy to serve. I was telling my 20-something kids just in the last few days that it's really great to work in the community with you guys. And the work is interesting. The people are great. Sabina, do you have anything to say? Any comment? Are you accepting the nomination?
I humbly accept.
Okay, same. Okay, all those in favor of Susan and Sabina as chair and clerk, say aye. Aye. SJ said aye online. Anybody opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Now,
Congratulations.
oh yeah, thank you. Now we'll move on to the bylaw modernization grant, and now
I will talk
turning it
about
over to
that.
Chris.
Yeah. Great. So this is just continuing our work on the bylaw modernization grant. Today, let's see, just kind of a refresher on where we are with our timeline. We're having our working group sessions and planning commission meetings to go through the final red line edits. In April, hopefully we will be through that and be able to schedule or warn for a public hearing, which would happen for the planning commission in May and then for the select board in June. So that is our timeline. Also, just a refresher on sort of what we are doing between now and June. On this list, we've already gone through the first one, which was talking about site plans, and I have an update from that tonight, also from our last discussion. And then tonight we are talking about section 13, principal buildings and private frontages in the form-based code in Riverside. The main question is, do the proposed changes further simplify the principal building general standards and other specifications based on comments that we had received from the planning commission previously? And then just sort of a reminder of some of the outstanding issues that we had heard from the planning commission on the last round of red lines, which we looked at in late to 2024. We've had our discussion on site plan review and some of the permit procedure stuff. Oh, David's saying he can't see the screen.
The slides,
Correct. It's
I-
not being, you're not sharing your screen anymore.
I can see the screen,
Oh.
David. So I wonder if up at the top, if you fiddle with your views. If you're clicked on the meeting view, then you won't see the screen, but if you click on Sabina Ernst screen, you should see the shared screen.
Let me fiddle.
Yeah, everything on this end indicates that we are sharing.
Yeah, let me know when you get that worked out, because I'm about to turn it over to you.
Should I stop?
Ah, there we go. I'm all set.
Great.
Thank you.
Cool. So at the last meeting, we had our discussion on permit reviews and site plan review. And then tonight we are talking about Section 13 and the Riverside Character-Based Zone, where there were multiple unresolved issues raised by the Planning Commission. Before I turn it over to David to walk through the red line that got sent out over the weekend, there was a unanswered question at the last Planning Commission meeting on February 18th, which was should the Development Review Board review all site plans in an overlay district? Should that be a required review? And there was some I would say, well, Wendy had suggested, well, let's check with the Conservation Commission and see where they are. So we had a working group with the Conservation Commission. And after a lengthy discussion, we got to the point where the Conservation Commission was comfortable delegating review of projects that touched on an overlay district, was comfortable delegating permitted uses in those districts to the ZA for review. So that does not include conditional uses, but it does, which is across the board. So based on that feedback, I am assuming that the Planning Commission is comfortable not including overlay districts as a trigger for a minor site plan going to the ZA for review.
The assumption behind that is that the NRO would be the most stringent or important overlay. I mean, I guess we checked with Conservation Commission about the NRO, but we're now lumping all of the overlays.
Correct. So there are, we covered this last time, but I can't remember. There are 4 overlay districts. There's the river overlay, the wellhead overlay, the wetlands overlay, and the natural resources overlay. All of those have criteria for approving permitted uses, and then specifies what types of uses would be conditional. The working group, the Conservation Commission actually looked at all of those overlay districts.
Okay.
And was comfortable with all of them being included. Yeah. And if you want,
led a painstaking review of each overlay meticulously with scenarios and examples and how would the standards be applied.
Okay.
Awesome.
yeah, and if there's anyone on the Planning Commission that wants to know more about that, we do have a spreadsheet that kind of talks through each of the overlay districts, what the intent is, what the review criteria are, and then what under the proposed changes would be delegated to the ZA for review. Yeah, and that's what we worked through with the commission. All right. Any questions or comments on that?
We learned a lot.
Thank
It
you
was
for
real-
that due diligence.
It was a really helpful exercise, yeah. All right, so now I am going to turn it over to David White, who will walk us through the work he has done to further simplify this section 13.
Thank you. My apologies for not being able to be there in person this evening. So I'll just walk through these slides here. Chris, certainly feel free to jump in if I'm missing something or there's something you want to interject. But really over the course of the last several months, through a couple of rounds of comments from all of you, a couple of sit-down conversation with Chris Flynn, the zoning administrator, as well as his written comments. Some time spent with Chris Brown, in addition to the written comments and conversations that Chris Shaheen and I have had. You have now a second red line version of Section 13, which we don't call the character-based code anymore. It's a form-based code for Riverside. So I'm going to talk about, in some broad strokes, what are the scope of changes from the previous draft. So this is not necessarily changes from what you currently have in place, because we've made quite a few already. I'm really focused on what have we changed from the previous draft that you saw last fall. So one of the things that I did is I fleshed out the preamble in the beginning of the code, which is non-regulatory, but is intended to provide a little bit of education and understanding of how the code is organized and how it's intended to work. And I'll actually dig into that a little bit more deeply, because I think it's really important that you all understand that kind of as a get-go. And we spent a lot of time getting rid of duplicative text, cleaning up some of the references, and really getting rid of a lot of the, let's say, more detailed prescription for building features, building elements, materials, and things like that, that I'll highlight as we go through it. Could I have the next slide, please? So focusing on a basic understanding of how the code works. There's a lot of stuff in here that, is necessary in order to kind of provide the framework for how the regulations work and relate to them both internally and externally with the rest of the zoning regulations and other town ordinances. But when push comes to shove, there are three principal parts of this code, beginning with the form district. So, well, I'll start with beginning with the regulating plan. The regulating plan is a zoning map. That's pretty straightforward. It identifies the area that this code applies to. But then there are form districts, and in this case, there's only one. So that's pretty simple. But the form district provides the basic framework for all of the regulations throughout the rest of the code. It focuses primarily on the organization of lots, and then the buildings that happen on those lots. So there are form districts. Then there are building types. Within a form district, it defines what types of buildings, not architectural styles and not uses, but generic types of buildings are allowed within that form district. And there are something like 7 or 8 of them. And each building type then identifies which of the frontage types are available for use with that building type. So there's a clear hierarchy as to how these regulations, how these different parts of the regulations relate to one another. And the purpose behind that is really to provide a tremendous amount of flexibility and to appreciate and accommodate the nuances between different types of buildings, whether it's a residential, whether it's a house or a mixed-use building, and then what are the common features and characteristics of that building and how it relates to the street, which is the purpose of the frontage type. So these 3 elements of the code are its heart and soul, and think of them really as puzzle pieces, beginning with the form district. I'll walk through this a little bit more in the next slide.
There's a little delay.
Ah, yes, I forgot about the delay. I'll try to give you a heads up.
Mhm. It wasn't taking this long before. Well, it
Wait,
might,
so when you press that button, there's a gray box that comes up on the Zoom, but doesn't come up on your screen, Chris, on your laptop. So press to it forward again. And it's that you gave a message about Sabina Ernst's screen.
Want me to see if I can make it look better?
well, I think mine all went through.
Oh,
Oh, so then all the way to the end.
too
Yeah.
far. There you go. That's speedy.
Yeah, well, now
One more. There you go.
there we
Right
go.
there.
Yeah.
So just to kind of put a finer point on this, from the perspective of an applicant, I own a piece of property in Riverside and I want to do something with it. So again, it's pretty straightforward. There's only one form district in Riverside. So you go to that section of the code that describes the form districts. It talks about the width of a lot, the front, side setbacks, all of those types of things that are, it describes in a general way. What are the ranges of setbacks? What are the ranges of lot widths that are permitted in this district? It talks about the range of building heights. And particularly important here, it defines which building types are permitted. So I own a piece of property in Riverside. I want to build a house. A house, by definition in the code, is anywhere between 1 and 4 units. So I see that, okay, a house is a permitted principal building type. I go to that section of the code. What does it say about a house? In that section of the code, it talks about the height. It talks about the width of the lot that the house building type can occur on, both a minimum and a maximum. It talks about the height. It talks about the number of floors, and in most cases, there's a range. Can be between 1 and 2.5 floors. How many units can be in that house type, which is 1 to 4. What the setback requirements are. And then it talks about what are the frontage types that are permitted to go along with that house. Then you would choose from the various frontage types to understand what are the requirements for that. So I want to put a porch on it. The frontage is very important in addressing how the building relates to the street and the sidewalk, how it engages with the street and sidewalk, in order to create a pedestrian, active and friendly environment. So I go to then the frontage type section of the code to see what does it say about porches. It defines what a porch is. There are a variety of different kinds of porches and how they relate to the principal structure. But the key thing in defining a porch is, what's a minimum size of it, at least 6 by 6, whether or not it can encroach into a front yard setback or not. That's very important to know. Does the building have to be set back even farther in order to accommodate a 6 or an 8 or a 10-foot porch? No, it may encroach into the first lot layer and other defining characteristics for that frontage type. So as I hope you can appreciate, it is highly flexible, and it is a kind of paint by numbers kind of tool with very, very generic form types in terms of the types of buildings and the types of frontages. So what's important to appreciate is that there are the standards for a house, its width, its height, the number of units, the setback requirements might be different for a different building type. For example, a mixed-use building. A mixed-use building can be 4 stories high. It doesn't need to have any front or side yard setbacks. If it doesn't want to, it can be closer to another building. It can be closer to the street because those are common characteristics of that type of building. Again, it's not about use. A house could include residential units or not. It depends on what uses are allowed in the district. But it's not specific to the building type. So it's a very modular approach as to how the code works. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about each of these different sections of the code and what are the key parts of it and what were some of the major changes that were undertaken to get to the current draft. So the form district. The form district defines the size of a block, the width of a lot. It doesn't care about how deep the lot is because Jericho doesn't have well-defined blocks. Some lots are deeper than others. Some lots are quite shallow. Other lots are really, really deep because there's a water feature that flows behind that. So it's much less important in the regulatory process how deep the lot is, but the width of the lot is important. And again, it's depending on the building type. The form district defines building placement, where the building gets placed on that lot, or at least where a principal building gets placed on the lot, is very, very important to a form code. You want the building to be placed closer to the street and sidewalk if you're trying to create a pedestrian-oriented, vibrant, mixed-use center. That is absolutely critical. So it defines where a building must be placed on the lot, and that is typically then between a maximum and a minimum front yard setback. That is both defined in the form district, but also may be different based on the building type. Amongst the edits and modifications and deletions from this section, a lot of general cleanup of some of the language. The bigger moving parts that we deleted were civic zones and civic spaces. We spent a lot of time talking about what are they necessary? Are some of the what we had originally included, are they appropriately sized in Jericho? And at the end of the day, it's not a critical element to how development occurs. From a use perspective, parks and green spaces and squares and all of those things are all allowed to occur, but we don't need to define kind of the parameters around kind of how they occur and where they occur. So all that stuff was removed. Oh, excuse me. So civic zones and civic spaces came out of the regulations. Also removed references to yard types. You will recall that there were references to side yard lots and front yard lots and rear yard lots. Again, that is kind of a technical detail around how buildings are placed on a lot, but ultimately it's more important to just let the setbacks define that. We didn't really need the yard top, so we removed that. And again, I already mentioned the lot depths, as well as, the lot depths was removed from the form district standards. So we can go on to the next slide. Principal buildings and private frontages. So the next section includes both of these components. Each one is set up where there are a set of general standards that are applicable to a principal building, and then the specific principal building types that are permitted in the code. And the same goes for private frontages. There are general standards that apply to all types of private frontages, and then there are specific examples with specific standards. And the key elements here for both of these sections is to define scale. Define the scale of buildings as they relate to one another, as they relate to what exists and what the future desired future is in this district. And primarily all about how do buildings and frontages activate the street and sidewalk and prioritize pedestrians. What's the pedestrian experience from the street and sidewalk? That's what matters most. What happens in the rear of the lot matters much, much less. So the regulations focus on the width of a lot, front and side setbacks, rear not so much. That largely don't exist in much of the code. The number of floors, the number of units, the height of the ground floor. Particularly when you get into a mixed-use building, you would expect that space to be bigger, to be taller than it would be often in a residential situation. Particularly the amount of window and door openings that's referred to as voids, to refer to them more generically. Those openings in the building are very important, not only how much of it they are, but how the size of blank walls, how far windows and doors are from one another, because large expanses of blank walls are not very inviting or engaging for pedestrians. They don't do anything to make the street more active. Location of a principal entrance is key to be on the front, and that parking goes in the rear. Again, there were reductions in the void requirements, largely going from 20% to 15% in some cases. The common yard frontage type was removed. You'll recall that's really just, a green lawn. And it was awkward in and of itself. It's not part of the building, and you would need to still put a porch or a stoop on the building anyway. So it was removed. I removed the building depth. We care less about how deep the building is and more about how wide it is in relation to the lot, in relation to the buildings that are around it, and the type of building that it is. A house building type is going to be on the smaller side. A townhouse building type, where they're attached in a row, they might be very, very narrow with no side yard setbacks at all for the middle units, but a side yard setback on either end for the end units. So the building types and the frontage types need to be able to accommodate that. A lot of the architectural details were removed. Again, the code is not about architecture at all, but it's about the physical characteristics and the physical details that are common to Jericho, to Vermont and New England. But a lot of those details were removed, things like side lights and muntins and porch railings and shutters. References to materials for both the siding of a building and the roof of a building were removed, as well as awnings and canopies. Awnings and canopies still talk about the shapes and sizes, but not necessarily what they're made of. And again, the yard types was removed, or references to yard types were removed from this section. Next slide. General development standards provides some kind of common foundation for, again, how the code works in defining what the lot layers are. That's how the code describes what happens at the front of the lot, so the front of the lot being the first lot layer between the facade of the building and the frontage line or the front yard. The second lot layer is then 20 feet behind that. And the third lot layer is in the back. And again, these are important definitions and descriptions of, or ways to describe a lot, so that you can just say what kinds of activities, what kinds of features can go in what part of the lot, i.e. parking. Parking can go in either a second or a third lot layer. It cannot go in the front lot layer, cannot be in front of the building unless it's in a residential driveway, as an example. The general development standards also include some things around parking, parking layout, design, landscaping, those types of things, as well as solid waste storage, structures, you know, where do you put the dumpsters? Where do you put trash cans, or how do you treat trash cans? That kind of information. The last section here then, before the definitions, has to do with thoroughfares. So thoroughfares are streets. They are both public streets and private streets. But the key thing is that they are public thoroughfares, meaning the public can use them. Just like a private road anywhere in Jericho, you know, you and I can drive on a private road, just like we can drive on a public road. They are public thoroughfares, even though the town doesn't own it and the town doesn't maintain it. But from the purposes of the regulation, they are treated the same in terms of how they are designed and how they're built. And again, this is about creating a multimodal, complete street, where there are accommodations for all types of users, whether you're in a vehicle or whether you're a pedestrian or whether you're a cyclist. So the key modifications to this section was bikeways, different types of bikeways that the code describes. They are required for every thoroughfare type, as opposed to an option. I got some very strong feedback from the commission on that. So that was added. We corrected the scientific names for the street tree selections, and we removed 3 of the thoroughfare types as being redundant and really unnecessary. Those were the neighborhood drive, the Park Street residential, and the Park Street mixed use. Again, all in an effort to try to simplify what are the street types, the thoroughfare types that are best served in Riverside. Next slide. So that's kind of a quick overview of what changes were made in this particular draft. So the key question for you now is, you know, what kind of questions and comments do you have? And at the end of the day, do you think that the edits maintain the most important elements to creating a walkable, vibrant, mixed-use neighborhood and have sufficiently simplified the code? I'll let you take it over from here, Chris.
Well, I think David's given a really good overview of the work that's been done. I know you had a lot to review this weekend with just getting the red line on Friday. But I think now it's an opportunity to discuss what your thoughts and feelings are on the red line that got sent out.
Can I make one question to start? Question, comment, you know? I just want to make sure that the question that we're answering is the right question.
Thank you.
Right? And so it's better than the first one. Like, it's a bit more expanded than our initial question was. So it's a bit more descriptive, but it doesn't call out as heartily as I think we wanted, perhaps, or I wanted, I should speak for myself, was the real creating a variety of easy development for a variety of housing, right? So I just want to make sure, like, as we looked at the whole town plan, we have said that that's something that's really important to us, is to have to spur the opportunity for increased development around a variety of types of housing for a variety of types of people and families. So does this question ask that also?
I think it's a really important observation, and I had jotted down the same thing, because I do remember in our earlier conversations, that was one of the bigger criterias that of a lens that we were looking through as we were going through this section and others. So I don't know, I don't think that necessarily captures what you were saying.
Yeah,
I think it needs to be expanded.
so I would love to just check with my fellow commissioners if we are open to expanding the question that David is asking us to consider. And if we're in agreement that that is also part of what we are looking for. Because I know the original form-based code and so much of the work that has been done historically around our town plan in conjunction with regional and state priorities around development, absolutely is captured in this question about mixed-use development and walkable neighborhoods. And I fear that you could conceivably do that with also not being very attentive or doubling down on the prioritization of a variety of housing and really making it possible for people in lots of like circumstances and across income levels to be able to afford to live in whatever we're helping to create here.
So, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say that I think that would come, where that would be brought into this more maybe than it is in the initial purpose and intent
Okay,
section. And I think that we could make that, state that more prominently or more strongly or both in that section. I also think that in that section, it would be, I would like to see a paragraph that mentions the idea of creating a hierarchy of spaces on the site as a whole. Because I think ideally, there would be a core that would have bigger buildings in more density, and that would transition out to smaller scale, both in the building sizes and in the street types. And I think in my opinion, one of the most important reasons to have form-based code in Riverside is that a lot of it is an empty lot. And so we have the opportunity to really create space there. And that's what form-based code is really great at, is creating space. But I think it would be best, in my opinion, if that area had a hierarchy of scale and public to private, and so that there's a sense of a center, but then the whole thing isn't that scale. And so I think we could have a statement that lays that out in the purpose and intent section. I also think that the purpose and intent section could emphasize more strongly the idea of a walkable community, and that could be, also along with the housing, could be right near the top of this list of things, so that it's really prioritized. If that answers your
Yeah.
question.
no, that's really helpful, Chris.
I think that Chris and David are rightly so trying to corral us into evaluating the edits against a metric. That's what this question is for. And I think what you're saying, Heidi, is this the right question? So when I think in order to move the ball forward, if we maybe should take a minute, make sure we can agree that we can rephrase this question, but for the purpose of our discussion, if we could all assume that when we read the word neighborhood, that we are including in that a very high priority for different types of housing, for different sizes, for different incomes, for different segments and so forth. And if that can be reframed later on, but for the purpose of this discussion, if we all can say like, okay, when I see neighborhood, that's what I'm thinking. I'm not just thinking any old neighborhood, I'm thinking neighborhood where there's lots of different types of housing, so that we can use this question for tonight.
I'm fine with that. too.
Okay.
That was just, I wanted to
Yes,
make sure.
But yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's good, because we want to be really hard on ourselves to make sure that we're solving our challenges and that we're making progress on the things that are most important to us, which is where that is.
Mhm.
Okay, so is everybody good with that? Okay, now Chris, I think, started to then offer ideas, like, okay, if we all agree that's the question, his answer to this question is probably, yeah, it does some stuff, but there's ways it could be better. And you offered ideas for how it could be better to better meet the goal. And one thing you talked about is the hierarchy, where there's a core and a surrounding area. And I think that's an important question, because I think what David will remind us of is that the current form-based code has a core and an outlying area in the way it describes CD3 and CD4. And one of them, never remember which one of them is the more intense one that allows for bigger buildings and allows for more uses, and the surrounding one goes into more residential. Previous planning commission meetings, before Chris was here, I think, we had kind of come to a conclusion that, and I don't really remember exactly, David, you might remember better how we got to this, that we thought that that was a little complicated. And could we be less prescriptive and more streamlined and more simple to meet this goal if we just looked at the Riverside as one? And I think you're saying maybe you never agreed with that, or maybe now that you've thought about it more, and I think I'm willing to reconsider it also, not because I want to go backwards, but more because I think it's a really important question that does the site, that whole neighborhood, you're kind of trying to create lots of little neighborhoods within a much larger, to be cohesive and functional, there is a hierarchical structure potentially that would make it more functional.
I think, and this actually goes to Wayne's question at the start of the meeting, basically, but I think it's worth remembering that at the moment, there is a single landowner for a lot of the undeveloped land. And with a site plan, so there's an opportunity within that scenario for an overall site planning to be laid on the whole property. If that person decides to move on and it gets parceled up into smaller lots with different owners, then the opportunity to think about the layout of the street as a whole, of the site as a whole, changes. So I wasn't necessarily suggesting that we would reintroduce CD3 and CD4, but
Okay.
I think that my answer depends a little bit on whether there's a single owner or not. If there's a single owner, I think it would be relatively simple to have some language in here that describes that. If there's not a single owner and it's sort of developed in a more piecemeal manner, then it might argue for including two different districts so that we don't have, a four-story building next to a row of existing small houses.
Right. So David, when we initially eliminated the distinction between, we decided to have one form district in your language that we've now all learned so much more about. Thank you very much, actually, for your presentation, because it's really good to have the same terminology. So Riverside used to have two form districts, and now we were discussing, and you've been drafting as if it has one. Do you have a opinion about that? Or given,
I'm trying to unmute him.
Oh.
Sorry.
she's trying to unmute you, so, but given the conversation, I think I remember, we were like, it's not that large of an area. We didn't want to have it be too complicated.
No, that was exactly right, and that the other part of the district, the area that is currently the form district, is by and large what was, and I too get confused, is it CD3 or CD4, but I think it was SJ saying it was 4. The most intense developed area is largely what you see on the map now. Much of the rest of the form code it was allowed to be mixed use, but it was a little bit less intense. So you did narrow that down. To Chris's point, I agree that with a single landowner in the middle, you could have a well-defined core, which is just given the fact that it's largely undeveloped site, that's where a lot more of the newer and perhaps larger, to the extent that the code allows it, buildings are going to go. Because anywhere else, there are already a well-defined pattern of lots and buildings, and it's unlikely that, there's going to be, lot consolidation and tear downs and things like that to create larger buildings. So naturally, I think they will occur on that large parcel. And there is already an approved subdivision for that site already. So that a lot of that work has already been defined.
I want to say, so it is in one owner, and that one owner may move forward with development at all, but there's nothing preventing the owner to sell off individual lots and have other people develop the property.
Right.
And I
Correct.
don't know if it's appropriate for us to assume that nobody would buy 3 houses in a row and tear them down and put up a 4-story building. I mean, that certainly has happened in a lot of places.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a safe assumption. If we are sort of drilling down into this topic. I mean, my in an ideal world, and well, I'll just say it. I think it would be great if the town developed the streets first, and then the developers came and put buildings on the street network that the town established, so that would clearly define the hierarchy of space and scale and everything else.
I think the other thing that we looked at when we were looking at CD3 and CD4 is that the surrounding area is the traditional village center zoning for Jericho, the same zoning that's in Jericho Center, Jericho Corners. And I think David audited and showed us the differences. And what we found were that what was allowed in the village center, where it's all the surrounding area anyway, was the same as CD3, and in some ways the same as CD4. So we weren't really, we didn't really need that kind of transition because the other zoning already overrode it, and that we have that transition because you go from Riverside Village Code. Remember, we adjusted the map also to go to the village center, which was the surrounding. So the village center, in effect, in my mind, my simple mind, took away, and I was like, oh, is the village center traditional is like CD3. Riverside is like CD4, and the boundaries were drawn to basically make it that way.
Susan, and one thing to add to that conversation, or to reference from that conversation, is that we didn't want to downzone
Right.
the surrounding area. The underlying zoning allowed a lot to happen in that area. So we didn't want to create a bunch of nonconformities, which is always a good objective, but it makes it much more difficult to be more refined about defining a smaller space where something more intense can happen versus what can happen someplace else. And to Chris's point, he's absolutely right. The right way to do this is through an official map, define where any new streets go, and what their design standards are, and then let the development happen around them. That framework is really important.
Can we have the slide go back to our question, please?
I tried to get back. I think you need to do that.
But a point of clarification, that's not gonna happen. I mean, it's the best way to do it, but our timeline for getting this adopted is a very different timeline than an official map,
Right,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
And the fact that, there now is a subdivision plan for that area.
Correct. That's the bigger factor.
Right, okay, so Chris, you started down answering the question, does this simplify, does this help bring us toward the outcome that we want? It would be, do you have, I'm sure you have a million other ideas, so
I have other thoughts.
I guess we have a process question.
Right, well, I also want to give a little more context to the question,
Okay,
because David has in his contract 10 hours left to work on the red lines. And we have a timeline where we are trying to get through this process by the end of June. So that's just another factor. So the question is intended to kind of, keep us moving forward within that timeline.
Is this where we wanna be?
yes,
Okay.
thank you.
You're welcome.
And we're gonna think, when we see the word neighborhood, we're gonna really jump in our minds around housing as a big part of the neighborhood for right now.
And I want you to that is not to say that what we are talking about here is not important or is not valid. It's just sort of a reality of where we are with the project.
Can I ask another process question then? Because one of the beautiful handouts are documents that you prepared in advance, and I appreciate it sort of walked us through. There's what was before, here's the red line, and let's keep track of all the back and forth on comments in the chart that you made. Are we gonna go to the chart tonight, or is it going to be assumed that we already looked at the chart of what our comments were, and we're going, and if we have anything still qualified, now it's the time to raise that.
Yeah, so I sent the chart out sort of as a helpful guide to refresh ourselves as to what the comments were, and then David provided a response. Well, here's a response to that comment, and he's gone through that now twice and sort of.
right,
So if there are, I hadn't intended this, but yes, if there are specific comments on that you don't feel like have been fully addressed, now would be the time to raise that.
Thank you.
And if you're not-
But I just wanted to be clear about the exercise.
Yeah, and if people are not prepared to do that because it wasn't sort of given out as an assignment, if that is something you want to do, if you can do that and get them to me by the end of this week, we can follow up on that.
right, I was gonna ask the same kind of process question, like if we have detailed comments about the new red line,
Yeah.
how should we share those comments with you? Because I think tonight it would be helpful to be a little bit more high level, and we don't have time to go through everybody's probably comments.
Right, so I can tell you sort of on this side, the table that was sent out with put your comments in this format, that was super helpful in terms of then being able to organize it. How was that on your end? Was that a helpful tool? So I would say let's continue using that tool.
I think it was helpful, but sometimes I wasn't sure, like the differences between agree or done, or there was some it wasn't as clear to me whether the comment was incorporated into the red line, and to be honest, I didn't have time to go back and check.
So I think David can answer that question now. So if you put agree or done, what did that mean?
It meant that if the comment was, this kind of change should happen, or this is really important, I agree with that. So I made sure that point or that issue was addressed in the code, and particularly where it says done, I made a specific change that was being suggested or requested, or where I offered a response to how the code might be modified in order to address that issue. I would have said done. I tried to offer a response to each of the questions that were asked or raised.
Another thing I would ask to keep in mind, this process, there are a lot of red line changes
Oh, my God.
in multiple sections. Think about the amount of time we put into just making comments and edits to the density discussion, which was really looking at one page of text. This is looking at pages and pages of text. I don't know how to address that because there could be in-depth discussions on hundreds of nuances in the code. So I'm just kind of putting that out there just to kind of be aware of sort of the magnitude of what we're working on and what we're trying to get done by end of June.
And one other point to that, Chris, is that if I made a change to something that was already redlined, you wouldn't necessarily see it in the red line because the red line is a comparison of what exists today versus what's being proposed. It's not a red line comparison of what was proposed previously to what's being proposed now.
Right. So let's say we came to this meeting today and we were like, we love it, it's fabulous. Is your sense, David, that the current red line that we looked at basically incorporates or responds to all the comments that you agree with or that you were willing to change and includes your recommendations for new language or changes that you think should be like you'd walk away from it happy, or are there still things that you would like to get some direction from us on?
From my perspective, I think it's as good as it's going to be for now, understanding that it's always a work in progress and there's a lot more, tweaks that you'll want to do over time. But I think you're at a place where this can move forward. It is a more streamlined, more coherent and cohesive set of regulations than you had before, which was a key objective. And I think it's something that you can deploy and hopefully begin to see, okay, is it doing what it was intended to do?
Right.
And and then revise it over time.
So you're saying not perfect, but a lot better. And you think that you have basically responded to everything that you could, should, or would is reflected in the new red line. And the question on the table is, do we agree with you based on
Exactly.
what our goal was? Okay, so
Yes.
can we answer that question?
I would like to offer that I appreciate that it's a lot more clear to me where there are boundaries, but there are flexibility within the boundary set. And so David, thank you very much for that, showing the connectivity between the three different pieces so that I could see that we are providing an easier way for someone who wants to develop to have sort of a general sense of what are the options, but still have a little bit of a choose your own adventure, which I think was very helpful because I think one of the pieces that I would add to simplifying the code was also being less prescriptive about what it had to look like. And so, and I think it did a nice job of that in being less prescriptive, but still having boundaries for the values that we're trying to inform. So I'm feeling good about that.
And if I can add to that, David drafted a whole like how to use this code section up front.
Yeah.
And we worked on really emphasizing in that section where the flexibility is, but where the flexibility is, that it's not intended to be prescriptive. Oh, well, it can be prescriptive, but it also, there are options to not have to follow the prescriptions if you want to.
Right. And can I ask, I got lost between what was some of the, because I was originally looking at the red line one and not the clean version. There had been sort of like a flow chart that described what the steps were and then whether or not it had to go to the DRB or it didn't have to go to the DRB and where it had to conform and where it didn't. And I wish I could tell you what page that was on. Once upon a time. Is that sparking any?
Yes, I know. I do know what you're talking about.
Does that still exist, David, or did you take that out?
I took it out because I don't have the ability to edit it. I could make an effort at trying to recreate it.
So I would say, so I'm looking on at the marked up one, and it's
Yeah.
labeled H 168,
Yeah.
anybody else who's looking.
How to use the code.
How to use the code, I think that is enormously helpful to a user or someone to just really get a sense of a quick lay of the land. If the whole point is we are also trying to make everything we do more user friendly, I think a flow chart like this is super helpful.
I'd also like to see that flow chart simplified a little bit.
Yes.
Yes.
There are things that
Yes.
could benefit, but the concept
Yeah.
of having one, I think, is really
I think that's
helpful.
really good feedback.
Right, we also have to make sure that it dovetails properly with the major minor site plan
Yes.
table of
Yeah.
uses stuff that we've done in the other
Mhm.
parts.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, anything else, Heidi? Big picture from you for right now?
That's where I always go.
Okay.
big. I'm done with
Okay.
my big, thank you.
SJ, can I put you on the spot because you're on the Zoom and I think it's not fair for you to have to go last just because you're on the Zoom. But if you're not ready, that's okay too.
I think that was a pass.
Okay. Anybody else?
Oh,
here
no,
in the
no,
room?
it's
No.
not a pass.
Oh,
No.
no.
She needs to be unmuted,
Um,
Thank
I
you.
suspect.
I couldn't unmute myself. I am wrestling with a lot of tension. So I will try to succinctly lay out the three tensions that I'm feeling, and maybe that will be helpful. The first is I want to acknowledge the amount of work that was done that I had no part in. And so I really respect and believe in all of you that I now get to sit at the table with, and really respect the work that you've done this far. And I think that we share common goals and concerns. And so I am wrestling with that trust that I have for all of you, and also like the geek in me that really wants to get in there and like get after it, which is not the level that we're at. So that's just one thing, and I'm trying to harness that geek that wants to just get all up in there. I think the other thing that Chris, you kind of touched on it a little bit, is just this real tension between being overly prescriptive versus regulating the things that we want to regulate, and then letting people come up with creative ways to meet those, to address those concerns that we have, versus prescribing how people will address those concerns we have. And I understand the reason that you might choose a prescriptive approach like a form-based code because the benefit there is this bare land that we have that's going to be developed. And so if you give this, you can speed this up and make it easier and maybe even less expensive. And so like, I understand intellectually the benefit there. But I really bristle at the prescriptiveness that it feels like it imposes. And so that's a little bit of maybe just a philosophical problem that I have to sit with. But what it brings me to is the last tension, which is, and again, this is started to get crystallized by what Chris was saying. There is this particular area is both bare land, and it includes privately owned properties and sections of town where we want to encourage infill. And I'm not sure how infill is possible when you have prescriptive setbacks and all of the things that go into a form-based code. And I worry that we're compromising potential infill. And the only way then that we modify any of the existing private properties that exist are what Chris suggested, which is a tear down and then a big massive build after, buying up 4 properties instead of some of what I think we would define more as gentle infill. And so I think there's that initial philosophical tension, I think, is kind of borne out in the tension between this like undeveloped few lots or parcels and the surrounding neighborhood. And I understand wanting to like try to seamlessly meld those, and that's part of what you're working in with the farm-based code, but I worry that it is going to limit some of the things that we're hoping for in terms of infill. So I don't know that that helps anything, but that's what's happening in my head.
Can I try to allay some of those concerns?
Yes.
Or
please.
try? I can only try. So I totally appreciate that. There is always a tension between being prescriptive and allowing things to just kind of flow organically. And we've got a lot of beautiful parts of Jericho and other communities that did create themselves organically. That said, the purpose of the prescriptive nature of the ordinance is to be very clear about what you can do. So an applicant, a property owner knows right from the get-go, this is what's expected of me if I want to make improvements to my property. Particularly when it comes to standards around the width of a lot, setback requirements, those types of things. They are written to make it possible for some of the larger lots to actually be able to subdivide, allow them to split to do that gentle infill, because they're smaller. Those setback requirements are less than what they are today. There are no minimum lot sizes. There are no arbitrary density limits. So there's a lot, while it's prescriptive in where a building gets placed, it allows a lot more flexibility in where new buildings can fit into the existing fabric, and including the fact that you can have multiple buildings on a site without going through the PUD process. It's explicit in allowing for multiple principal building types, either at the frontage line or set back from behind another principal building, so you could create courtyards and that type of thing. So that's what it's attempting to do. At the end of the day, you'll know best when you see applications coming in that are doing those kinds of things or trying to do those kinds of things, and they're successful or not. And you're able to then fine tune to understand, okay, what's the barrier? This is an application that really, we want to see this kind of development happen here. What are we missing? Or what did we miss in creating the code the first time in order to allow this type of thing to happen? But I think we've done our best as a starting point.
And Essie, I would just add that among the concerns I have about the code, I am not concerned that we are limiting density. I think the setbacks are so small, and aside from the setbacks, they're from building heights, there are no density restrictions, and so I just don't think that's true. I think that people could create a lot of small properties there, once there's septic,
Once there's septic.
which will happen soon.
Indeed.
Wendy, you look like you're ready.
You saw my face.
Yes,
Well, but I don't have like,
it's okay.
my comments are more specific
Mhm.
because we've had so many conversations over a long period of time, sometimes it's harder for me to track whether or not they had actually been resolved. And one conversation that is just seared in my mind is the one about setbacks, and that we, at one time, we were talking about considering the road type that the lot was on as a maybe a determiner of the maximum setbacks. Because as I understand it now, that the maximum front setback is 20 feet. And that to me feels restrictive, and I understand the point about the relationship to the street and having it pedestrian friendly, and that is a priority. But I also think a priority is for the person who's living there, that feels just overly prescriptive to me. And so I could see that in the case of a mixed use building having it. And so that kind of made me think, David, about you were talking about how some of these are bound by building, that the building placement is by building type. And so
Right.
what flexibility can we have saying, okay, a mixed use building has a 20 feet front setback. However, you know, maybe I don't have all the building types in front of me here.
The house, which would be up to 4 units.
Yeah.
Right.
That there is no restriction on that is the choice of the builder and ultimately the people living there.
Right, and we were especially sensitive to and heard public comment about this, about this unique circumstances of Route 15 and
Right.
how Route 15 is a very different condition than Dickinson or a new small road that would go through a parcel. So David, did you address that conversation that Wendy's referencing, which I remember very well also?
So I'd have to go back at my notes to where I was measuring existing setbacks today. And kind of how they kind of play out, particularly along Route 15. But by and large, that's where some of those numbers came from. I would strongly advise against not having a maximum setback for any building type. You really need to bring those buildings closer to the street. However, you could have, in some cases, you could have a variation on that maximum setback, or even the minimum setback for that matter, based on frontage along Route 15. You could make that kind of differentiation. Because it's unique within the district that you might want to treat Route 15 differently from any of the other streets. But it would not eliminate a maximum front yard setback.
I know I'm one voice, and this is my last contribution on this point, but I disagree with that assumption that a resident has to be within 20 feet of the street. As someone who lives in a pretty densely developed neighborhood on Griswold Street, I think people should have choices about where their home is in relationship to a street. I understand mixed use and that there's a natural engagement between pedestrian and building location. But if it's a primary residence, I think that there should be choice. And I'm done.
I agree with a lot of that. One of the questions that I have about that is, today it's a house, so it has a driveway, and then 3 years from now, it's a toy store, and then it's a law office, and then it's a house. So how do you process that when you think about wanting to have choice of where you live in the house, and then David's saying, think about the pattern, think about the pedestrian experience, parking in front of buildings, all those other things, when the whole point is to take use out of the equation, which we don't really do because the house is a building type, which is very much a use type, a residential. So that's what I'm asking you to help me, because that's where I get stuck on being able to like solve that, because I agree with you. But then every time I solve it in my head and think like, okay, house gets its own setback flexibility, and maybe the variation that it gets is more, that would be one way to solve it with a Route 15, you know, a circumstance for Route 15. You know, I immediately go to like, okay, how would I write this? But then I think, then I take a step back and say like, but that's not a permanent situation. So now we've created a pattern that then can become mixed use, commercial, back to residential. That's what happens in cities and neighborhoods that are densely developed.
I think it's also worth pointing out that underlying any form-based code really is this concept that not everyone would agree with, that at a certain point, the greater good trumps an individual right. And that's, you know, the idea of creating a neighborhood has some sort of consistency to it and has a fabric to it as a whole is different than sort of total free will. And that's just part of one of the assumptions of underlying the form-based code. And I think that I hope to see, my aspiration is for a density of development in this area that would not feel overly suburban, and that would be denser so we get more housing and more people there. So I don't, it doesn't address your concern. I'm just trying to put it in in context with this code.
I'd also point out, I think your comment is heavily based on the type of traffic and the intensity of traffic and the design of Route 15 as it is today. I don't think that is conducive to creating a walkable neighborhood. I think this is for another time, but I think there's a question of what should Route 15 be where it's crossing through the villages? And is it really doing what Jericho wants it to do to achieve the goals that are in the town plan?
So David, do you think that there would be tweaks that you could make to? Oh, no, I'm not, I'm just still on this one particular point.
Wrapping us all.
No.
Okay.
To this particular issue around setbacks and Route 15, that would maybe provide some more flexibility, but without compromising the fabric of the whole.
Well, I guess what I can do is I can go back and remeasure the setbacks of the existing buildings along Route 15. That's the existing pattern, and the existing pattern ought to be allowed to continue and to perpetuate itself. But you can also, you know, understand that if you can have a principal building within a maximum and minimum front yard setback, and you can have multiple principal buildings on a lot, some of these lots are fairly deep, and you could create cottage courts and other things where you're creating other kinds of residential, typically, types of options, even if it's along Route 15. But the key thing is that you want to maintain the existing pattern of development that is there and make sure that the range of setbacks that the code allows reflects that. So like as I said, I can go back and remeasure that, and we can look at, does a different range of setbacks need to be deployed for properties that are just on Route 15?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Because the existing pattern, the setbacks from Route 15, a lot of those houses were built a long time ago, before Route 15 was what it is like today. So I
Yep.
don't understand why we need to maintain that. Like, it's not desirable today.
Well, because the underlying objective here is that you're trying to maintain the pattern of development that exists and allow for new infill. And if you're allowing for buildings, not only does it affect the pedestrian nature of the sidewalks that the town's built along Route 15, you're also consuming a lot more land to have a bigger front yard, and not enabling smaller lots, smaller yards, smaller building types. It's much more land consumptive.
So your answer was, did you think you can, so you're gonna go back and revisit, so this part to revisit for sure? About
I will,
thinking about Route 15.
yep, I will remeasure the front yard setbacks of the buildings that are along Route 15. And then we can kind of talk about, okay, this is the, these are the numbers that I come up with. So you would have a range of what exists there today, in order to kind of judge that against what does the code currently say, and do you want to adjust those minimums and maximums?
Okay, and then, because I think you've given us a lot to think about, Wendy, and I think it's not, I don't think we have the answer right now, but it'll be something that's on our, we have like a meeting or two of items to resolve.
Yeah. I have one.
Yeah, you have one
I
more.
have just one more about, just to make sure that I'm clear on my understanding and I'm clear that we're not being restricted here. And this, I'm looking at the chart here. And it's about lot width and building width maximums. And so a mixed use building can be on a lot as wide as 150 feet. And I think, Chris, you had brought up this too. And then it also says that under a comment under one of your comments, this was that a lot width can also be bigger for multifamily housing. So what I want to make sure is that 150 would apply to projects such as Liscombe House.
When you say the
Would
chart,
apply, you mean accommodate?
Accommodate, yes.
when you say the chart, are you referring to
The
the
comment?
comment
The
matrix?
yeah.
Okay.
So go ahead.
So if a mixed use building can be on a lot as wide as 150 feet, is that also a multi-family house? What would Wisdom House building type be?
So a mixed use building has more than two or more units in it. It's not about use.
Okay.
It could be multifamily. It could be largely residential with a small portion of commercial. It could be entirely commercial. It's just a mix. And as we understand the basic concept and program for a Wisdom House, it would fit within this particular generic box of of a mixed use building, and in this case, allowing to have 0 front and side yard setbacks. So you could have attached buildings, attached mixed use buildings.
Thank you.
I have other comments on building widths and stuff, but which I wasn't gonna do right now, but on this particular, since Wendy brought this up, it seems a little odd to me that a mixed use width would be 150 feet max and a townhouse max would be 200 feet. I would think that why not just make the mixed use the same as the townhouse? Why, it seems like a mixed use is potentially bigger than a townhouse, so I didn't understand that. I would increase the mixed use to 200 feet.
Well, I guess
So-
I was just gonna say, on the table, the total frontage width for townhouses is 200,
Yeah,
but the unit width is 30. So you're breaking up that 200-foot with a number of smaller units that are still giving you a more pedestrian type scale.
well, but we have a requirement to break up a big facade into smaller units. That's separate from, in my opinion, from
Yeah.
what the overall width should be allowed. Anyway, But
Just to try to add a little color to the thinking behind those numbers for the townhouse is that it also has a minimum side yard setback, at least on one side, if not on both, of 5 feet. And it's the lot width maximum is trying also to accommodate a driveway that provides access to parking in the rear. So even though your unit width maximum is 30 feet with a maximum of 8 townhouses per run, so 8 times 30 is going to be more than that 200. But if you did smaller units, you could fit those 8 units across the site and still have front-loaded driveway access.
that's fine. We can dig into this later, I think. I just,
Mhm.
in general, I think a mixed use building, I think of it as being the biggest building we might get there, but anyway. I have anyway, I have small things which we can talk about later, but I have a broad stroke question. So first of all, thank you for all the edits you did. I really appreciate how much you took out. And I would suggest that I think we could eliminate the frontage type section altogether. I think that there might be a few minor things that we want to include on the building type, like the fact that a house's front porch could encroach into the setback, but otherwise, I think it's a level of detail that we just don't need, and I think it's overly complicated. I think the best use for this is a broader, the best use of the form-based code is the broad kind of massing and density and scale, which is addressed by setbacks, height limits, and those issues, and streetscapes and that kind of thing. And I just don't think we need to get concerned about somebody's porch or somebody's front door or somebody's courtyard. I think that's a level of, I think that it feels to me like that's a carryover from the existing code. The existing code, as we all know, is sort of everything, including the kitchen sink version of form-based code. And I think that it feels unnecessary to me, in my opinion, for Jericho. So I would suggest we could just eliminate that section. And we might want to include under a house type that something like the front porch can encroach into the setback, but otherwise I just think we just don't need the frontage type section in my opinion.
I agree with that.
Can we just do a quick check-in with all of the commissioners
On that particular.
on that particular thing? Because that's a pretty big change,
Mhm.
and I think it'd be very helpful in
Sure.
that one to just check in and see where we all are.
Okay,
Because
so Wendy, you said you agreed with that.
Mhm.
Sabina, do you agree with that in general, in particular? Heidi?
Yeah, I strongly agree.
SJ?
Hence the request for the,
She's nodding, yes. David and Chris, would we be making a big mistake to eliminate it? You wanna arm wrestle us, tell us why we should keep it, what parts of it we should keep more than others?
So I think there certainly are form codes out there that do not include this kind of format of identifying frontage types. Most of them do include some very specific requirements for how a frontage is treated, and how a facade is treated on any building. So some of that is included in the general standards for frontage types, which I think is very important to maintain. It's a fundamental part of how your original code is organized and designed to work. So it is a pretty big change, and I think there's a lot of things to try to lot of holes to try to fill if this section is removed, to make sure that, again, this is a critical part of how you create walkable, pedestrian engaged and inviting spaces, is how the building presents to the street. And Chris, I think it was Chris who texted me screenshots of the two images that your public forum speaker raised, and I can't tell in both cases, but certainly one of those cases, the more you dumb down the form-based code, the more you get buildings that look like that, because there's not detail around how does that facade articulate itself relative to the street.
Disagree. So, there's nothing in here that says you have to have an arcade, you have to have a gallery, you have to have a courtyard, you have to have, there's nothing in here that requires those things. And so just because the code has those, doesn't mean we're going to get them. And I think that that's really important to remember. If we required using these, then we would absolutely have to describe how we want them to look. But the fact that the buildings that Wayne brought don't have those is not a result of a dumbed down form-based code, because those buildings could still be built with, even with these frontage types listed, because we don't require that people use these frontage types. So I just disagree that having the frontage types is going to get you a more pedestrian friendly building front. I think that if someone's interested in doing an arcade, then they might want to dig into that on their own. I also just sort of disagree that it's the place of the code to design the buildings. I think it's the place of the code to define how we want scale, massing, pedestrian friendly, those kind of values. We are never going to get the code to design the buildings and to create more beautiful architecture. It's just not going to happen.
Nor should it try to define beautiful architecture. I totally agree. But I may have misunderstood your point, but these frontage types are required. You must choose one of them. You don't have to choose one in particular. You must choose one of the frontage types that's permitted by the building type that you've selected. You can't forego that section at all.
Well, where does it say you have to have a courtyard?
It doesn't say you have to have a courtyard. It says that you have to have a frontage type.
Or I guess I don't understand why you have to have a gallery, you have to have an arcade. I don't think it.
I read it that the building type has to have a frontage, and the frontage has to be of a type, and of a type that's one of these. And even though they kind of look very particular, when you actually read the language, there's a lot of ways you can interpret that. Like my courtyard could look a lot different than your courtyard. But I don't know where it says it exactly, but I read it as if you have to have a frontage type on a building, on
Well,
the principal frontage.
I
It doesn't say that?
still, well, it lists frontage types, but I didn't read that to say they're required.
Mhm.
I read that to say these are suggestions. I still think it's a step beyond what we need. But that's,
I like the choose your own adventure part if we're gonna require, and it sounds, if I'm hearing it correctly. You are saying you must choose one, but you have 6 or 8, I'm making this up, to choose from. Yes.
I mean, that's the way I read it. I don't know, David, is that correct? Yeah, I know she has her hand up.
That's exactly right. So it's section 13.4.2B. All principal buildings shall have at least one principal entrance on its facade facing the principal frontage, which shall be defined as part of the private frontage types selected from section 13.4.5.
but they all list doorway as an option. So in theory, you could just, okay, this is my frontage type, it's a door.
Yeah.
So just I don't think we are not gonna use this to avoid the examples that Wayne brought in. I just don't think it's gonna work that way because my frontage type is a door. And you said it's gotta be 3 feet wide. Okay, it's 3 feet wide. I mean, so I just think it's not. If that is in fact what we want to do, then it needs to be done differently, but I don't think we should try to be doing that.
I'll say, in general, I agree with the intent to take out the frontage types, but I would be very reluctant to do that without making sure we have something in the code that gets us the result that we're looking for. Regulations aren't going to result in design excellence. Regulations are intended to make.
Surrounded by that.
What's that?
We're surrounded by that.
Yeah. Regulations are intended to keep the worst thing from happening. And it can help us shape what we want to see to some extent. So I think, the form-based stuff that's in the section, the form section does a lot of that, but it doesn't get us that next level of articulation on a building facade that is really critical to creating that nice pedestrian walkable community that you want. You can leave it up to the private sector to do it, but then you're going to get what you get.
Yes, and the examples of form-based code that have followed that more prescriptive, we're sort of tripping over them. Taft's Corners is full of them. I don't consider those to be architectural gems.
Or walkable gems.
Yeah.
Or walkable.
They're not
So,
forgetting the
I just don't-
architecture.
I mean, ideally, you have a code that requires certain things that give you that scale and just gives you an outline of what they are and lets the applicant, the architect, the builder, whoever, figure out how to use those to come up with what they want. And that's really tricky.
Yes.
Okay, so David, she took her hand down because I think Chris got it when he said a door is a frontage type, right? So if you're saying the frontage type is important, and now you explain to us that frontage type is required, and you cited it, so it is required. But Chris is saying, yeah, but one of my types can be a door, and that is not necessarily going to deliver a result. Is there a way which I think if you're describing it as you're trying to avoid the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that everybody chooses that frontage type and that's all you get, and none of this other really nice stuff that's in the illustrations. So that does seem to be something that needs to be improved. Either, almost like simplifying again and making sure the frontage types are flexible and as only what we really need, but enough that of what we're saying we need that we don't wind up with just a door. Except sometimes a door isn't the right thing, especially if it's a house. Or if it's a warehouse, or if it's a, I don't know. So I don't have a good answer, but
Well, I think that it's particularly perhaps concerning for a mixed-use building. Where, yeah, in some places, a doorway is going to be appropriate on it. But the mental image most of us have for the mixed-use building is a shop front. And
But we have
typically,
but the shop front is required in another section, the amount of glazing. I mean, Bridge Street in Richmond is largely doors. There's just a lot of glass.
yeah, we don't require a shop front any place in particular, and some codes do. Well, use Burlington as an example. There are blocks of the downtown where you are required to use the shop frontage type. Because that's where we are trying to concentrate and activate pedestrian activity the most. So that's one way that you're using, the streets to define that character more.
But I think we could do that with a sentence on the building type page that says, if it's a storefront, glazing must be 70% or whatever we think.
Oh, for sure, but you're then are requiring that mixed use building to take a very specific form and not giving it the choice to be something else. You're requiring it to be, street level retail and upper story office or residential. If you're requiring a shop front in a mixed use building.
Oh, I'm not requiring a shop front. I think if we get at the glazing component, I think we could get there with that probably. I don't know. I find the frontage types to be, they feel academic to me, overall, but, I'd like to think we could find a simpler way to get at our top priority items. And we may just disagree on that too.
Is part of it the level of detail in the illustrations that make them look like Disney's Main Street as opposed to being a more stripped out illustration that just has the right, that just has the elements on it?
Well, no. That's not really for me.
so how do you,
I'm just I'm looking at the courtyard page and I'm just trying to think, well, what part of that is really important? And I don't know. I think we could, maybe one exercise is to go through the frontage types and say, what are the most important elements that we want to get from this?
yeah,
And is
that's,
there some other way to get those so that we don't have to have 15 pages of all of this? Because
or not some other way, because it sounds like because of the building block structure, you don't want to pull out the Jenga piece and have the thing fall down.
sure.
So David made me cautious about removing it, but you're convincing me that we could go further to make it simpler. And, is that fewer of them? Is that simpler illustrations? Is that less text to describe? Is it less prescriptive? But I think without them, then how does the code describe the intersection between the private space and the public space, or the building and the sidewalk, or the building and the street? I thought the frontage type was kind of the bridge. And you could have maybe a lot of flexibility in the building type and how you mix and match them and how you interpret the requirements. Like, I could do it really modern, you could do it really traditional, but without the frontage type, what's the bridge?
Yes, and the frontage types are varied enough that I still don't think it's that because we list them, it's going to get you what you want, because there's always the out of saying it's a door, or it's an office front, which has, you know, sort of minimal glazing or less glazing. I don't, that is the concept of the frontage type, but I think that as it is right now, I don't think it's going to get us what we want. Because we're not saying you have to have a porch. We're saying you have to have, what you have to have is a door. You don't have to have anything else. It'd be nice if you did.
Chris, would you change your opinion if we just eliminated the door as one of the options?
No,
Okay, just wanted to.
no, but I mean, we could, I think it would be a worthwhile exercise to go through this and say, what are the most important things? And is
Okay.
there some other way?
To meet the goal of a
To meet the goal.
walkable neighborhood
Right.
with a lot of
Pedestrian-friendly,
very types of
interactive,
housing.
super awesome.
Yep.
neighborhood.
Okay, Sabina,
No, SJ not very enough.
I know, we've already heard from SJ.
Mhm.
She's got her hand up again, I think.
We're gonna go back to her. Don't worry, SJ. But I don't want to put you on the spot. I just want to give you an opportunity to offer any like comments.
I don't have any additional comment.
Okay. SJ. Oh, does somebody have to unmute her? So,
She's waiting so.
It's so frustrating, guys.
Hmm.
I'm gonna come like in a biohazard suit and sit in a corner just so I never have to experience this again.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. So I came at this from the complete opposite perspective. As soon as I saw the frontage types and I saw doorway listed, I was like, what housing or what building type are you not allowed to use a door? And I was like ready with my red pen to circle it. And then I saw that there was a doorway as an option in every single type. And it was like, well, then why are we specifying if anyone can use a door? Then what I had the same reaction that Chris had, but I came at it from an assumption that, oh, we're not letting people use doorway. And so I'm gonna find that and I'm gonna raise a stink about it. And then the other thing is I was like, okay, well then if everybody can use a door, then there must be some kind of distinction for the frontage, or where the distinction is the facade. So mixed use buildings and small commercial buildings have to have a 40% void on their front facade, which is, I think, kind of what you're getting at with the shop window or the glass or whatever. And so like that's the distinction between those buildings and strictly residential buildings. And then I'm thinking, okay, so now we've got a building, it's got the 40% void, and then 20 or 30 years that becomes a residential only use. Well, now you've just got a big bay window in the front, in your living room that looks out onto the street. And we have that a lot all over the place. So that feels really flexible and fine to me, which then brings me back to, I don't understand the point of the frontage, because we do have a way of kind of sort of distinguishing with this 40% void versus 15% void for residential that is flexible enough, I think, that you can go, you can do a lot of things with a building with that 40% void. And any building can have a doorway. And so any building, just because every building can have a doorway doesn't mean that all of a sudden no one knows what a porch is or a courtyard is anymore. Like those options still exist. So then why do we need to prescribe all of those things and overly complicate or add all of this extra to our regs? Because again, if you're worried about people choosing the most simple, stamp, then they can do that with the doorway anyway. So that's it.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock and it feels like there's more work to be done on frontage types. Okay, so can we move on to so those are all the like big picture comments. The only big picture comment I would add is to everything that everybody said is that I still think the language can be simpler. There are way too many as applicable, even in the same sentence. And there are many places where I feel like the regulations say and that you have to comply with the regulations. And that it's like, it's so, we had this conversation in our last meeting, not about this, but where we were, well, when we were talking about site plan, where like we can't say all the other parts of the regulations apply, because otherwise you would say that in every single sentence. So I feel like there's a very simple exercise for getting all of the content, but just of the language of going through and saying, what is the noun and what is the verb? And what words are needed and how to make this simpler for a lay person that wouldn't change any of how it works, but it would just make it simpler to read. And I would like to figure out how we can do that. Okay, so now it's after 9 o'clock, but I do feel like we have had the patience of people joining us and that we, with the planning commission, agree to stay a little bit late so that we can invite public comment.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much for staying. You'd come forward and say your name and please just give us a really brief comment and just know, once again, we are very much in discussion mode, not making any final decisions. Chris and I are available anytime offline, but please come forward and share your comment. Yep. Bill, you had your hand up first.
I know. I thank you, Wendy, for seeking that clarity. I'm Bill Butler. And so
You can sit down if you
I
want.
think it was really helpful that you did that. And I'm assuming, and this is the first time I've been able to use that word, that we can build this. And I'm not getting any nays from people. So I'm very heartened. Thank you very much. One thing is we want to build underground parking and that under that 30 or 40 units of underground parking. We hate parking lots as much as you all do. But the previous zoning, as Michael has explained to me, is onerous and the underground parking probably wasn't paid much attention to. So we'd like to make sure that we're all on the same page with how that's all going to work. So one little small thing is I've walked in the back of a lot of these houses on Route 15 and all the action's in the backyard. You know, people, the front yard is their problem, but the swing sets and what looks like a community action is all on that back hillside that heads towards Riverside. And I think it'd be a wonderful opportunity to invite those people in and incorporate them into what we're doing, because that's where they play. So let's just remember that and then think about how to blend them into what we would like to do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Wayne, I wanted to come back to your pictures too, by the way.
That's kind of, well, first I just had one question. I heard David talking about parking in the back and bicycle lanes on the road. So I'm assuming then that the parking is off-street, enabled bicycle lanes and stuff. Is that-
Parking is both on street and behind, or just not in the front of the buildings that are not houses. So a lot of the streets are intended to be shared,
Mhm.
cars driving, on-street parking, and bicycle, and depending on the street, the bicycle is sharing the lane with the road or has a separate bike lane.
But the house has off-street parking, right?
The house has off-street parking. And I mean, lots of buildings can have off-street parking as an underground parking
Thank you.
included, or parking lots.
Okay.
Actually, the subdivision that's already been approved using the code as it exists now has parking lots, a surface level parking lots
Okay,
too.
because like in Essex Junction, they have transient parking in front of the places of business.
Yep,
But if you look at where the apartments are,
right,
it's all behind.
right,
Okay, perfect.
yeah.
And then I guess my only other point coming back to these questions is this is the nightmare scenario.
Mhm.
So if you're looking at all of the, but so if you consider the zoning changes, this is what would just destroy that little community you want to do. And again, Bill should hold his picture up again, but I took the picture of this because I'm thinking from my memory, he had something along those lines. And then this because it's just, it's a non-conforming neighborhood. So anyways, that's my little piece, and then.
Yeah.
Question.
Well, what I was gonna say is after the discussion, so you heard us talking about things like frontage type and how close the building is to the road and no front parking. When I look at this picture, I'm pretty confident and very hopeful that the current code and the changes that we would make would not enable this as a street facing building. Is this potentially the back of a building where you have solid waste? Remember, David was mentioning that it's regulating solid waste, it's allowing parking. There's a decent amount of windows here. The building is probably, I don't know how big this building is. There's some variation in the facade, as these guys like to call it. So there's, it's not just one flat, whereas this, and that's what they're trying to do with this building,
Yeah,
is they probably have a requirement
yeah.
to change the materials every blah, blah feet and to change the surfaces every so number of feet. And that's what Chris, who's an architect, is pointing out. The code is trying to prevent a big blank building, but what the person has done to comply with the code is produce this building, which I understand you might not like. But in this particular building, it's hard to say what it's doing in the neighborhood.
Oh, it's a big, huge apartment building.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Whereas this building, it's hard to say because we don't know what the front of the building looks like.
I think it looks
But-
exactly the same.
Well,
I see the front.
that would, if that is the front,
Yeah.
this code would not enable
Okay.
this building as far as I could, I mean, I'm not a zoning expert, but as far as I could tell, because a large building does not allow a big front parking lot, would require frontage like a door, or that's why we're debating like, is a porch or these kinds of elements that make the building more interesting, which is what these buildings, so this is probably like a townhouse structure.
Yes.
Where you have individual doorways, which the code does encourage.
Mhm.
And there is a lot of flexibility for small and close together.
But I mean, if you look at Bill's building here, over up there, yeah.
Right, so that building is a bigger building, but what they've done is they're right on the street, which David tells us is fabulous.
Yeah.
And they have active spaces on the street.
Undulations.
They have commercial, they have some
Porches.
dining, they have porches, they have articulations, they have different roof lines and all of those things. This code as it's currently written, encourages and has some, maybe like the problem with the current code is it probably doesn't like the slope of his roof
Why?
because it thinks it's too shallow.
Mhm.
And our revisions are eliminating, we will probably propose,
Okay.
nothing's definite. We will probably propose to allow that kind of a shallow pitched roof, which it doesn't currently allow, which would be a problem.
We want to please the eye,
Yeah,
as well as provide housing and commercial. We
So-
want to live there.
So now if we get that, and this goes in right across the street from it, that's the nightmare scenario.
it's the nightmare scenario if that like ruins the street.
Mhm.
However, if that parking lot is behind, it's well screened, it's well lit, it's safe, that building is close to other buildings, and that provides 20 affordable apartments. It's not a nightmare scenario in my,
So why can't affordable apartments look like that? You can put that as.
I mean,
apartment.
that might be our preference.
Yeah,
But the question is, what's right for the town to require when it's a preference as opposed to a function?
I have an idea about how we can address this, which I will send to you
Okay,
guys tomorrow. So I think we can get there.
okay.
I'm confident.
I'm confident we can get there
I just
too.
No,
wrote
that-
up with one thing, if they're affordable, they should not, Heinsberg has, language that says if it's affordable, I'm paraphrasing, it's not supposed to look different, it should look
Right.
like
Yeah,
what,
That's
a millionaire can afford, or
right.
anyways, I don't want to take up all the time.
Yeah.
on somebody else.
Okay,
We expect to coordinate with Greg,
yeah,
okay? You all know that.
yeah. Okay, I think we have to move on.
So I'm
Thank-
looking at
Yes.
June, ahead to
Yeah.
June. I would like to have very clear direction from the planning commission tonight on what it is, what the desire is. So then I can work with David and figure out the best way to do that. So there's been a lot of discussion. Doing away with frontage types, but then it sounded like maybe there was reluctance to do that. There's clearly no love of the door requirement. So anyway, to some specific, like 3 bullet points, no more than 5, something that I can take and focus on to come back to the planning commission.
I would like 24 hours to think about the frontage types and address that
Okay,
in a different way.
and in fact, that I know I forced us to all weigh in, but I would be happy to withdraw my forced weigh in. If Chris Brown, that is, thinks there's a creative solution that now that
Mhm.
he's heard all of this, I would be happy to delay, and if we're allowed to look at what Chris Brown is proposing and give you feedback either individually or as a group.
I don't want to overstate this, but in general, it sounds like the form part is okay, except for the setbacks, which we need to look at. The general standards, we didn't really get into. I don't want to say they're okay, but we haven't really talked about that. The direction type is really specifically looking at the frontage types. Is that accurate?
That's the crux of the big broad stroke question.
Okay,
Mhm.
I do think I would be in favor of revisiting the initial purpose and intent. 2 pages. And maybe tweaking the emphasis and adding something there, but,
Yeah,
and then I have little things that I can
yeah,
talk to David about.
so I would say that the 3 big buckets, frontage types, setbacks specifically for Route 15, I'll narrow that to specifically Route 15, and then the purpose and intent section.
I would call the purpose and intent section underneath the big bucket of comments. Because there's still where you said we could email comments to you by like the end of the week. I'm not saying that that's not important, but there's lots of other comments, at least that I have, that are not worth discussing, that are just
Mhm.
little grammatical typo questions like that I have that I think I could resolve just by sending them an email to you. So I envision one more draft that incorporates potential discussion changes about setbacks, frontage types, general comments, including the purpose and intent section, and there's a couple of other, like site plan is a little confusing to me too. And then some simplifying language.
And I hate to do an and, but we didn't talk about parking and the alleys. And I think that is worth reviewing, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think the site plan that was submitted, I don't know if they felt like they needed to use the alleys or if they just really wanted to use the alleys, but it has alleys, and as a result, there's not a single part of that site you can't drive to, and that seems somewhat ironic, given that we're trying to make the focus more pedestrian.
Right, and like one of my comments from, several months ago on the chart was there's no thoroughfare for only for a pedestrian type thoroughfare, like Church Street. So we need a thoroughfare that's pedestrian only, and I didn't see that in the red line, and so that was gonna be in my comment to you, like, where's my pedestrian only thoroughfare?
Absolutely.
Well, I would say that I don't think you need to have that because there's nothing preventing someone from doing that. I mean, what the
We could
thoroughfare,
encourage it.
But there's
We
no
could encourage it.
specification, if the whole, part of the reason you wanna have building types and frontage types is so that you can choose your own adventure and pick and choose and make it fast and easy, and this is what you do, it's like, great, you could have a pedestrian boulevard, this is what it needs to look like, I'm gonna put it right there. It's one of the most important things, why wouldn't we describe it, if that's the point of describing things, is to make it easier and simpler and faster and cheaper?
I mean, I'm just hearing a tension between being prescriptive and giving the direction and not being more general in what we want to
But if we
see.
included it, it would be a small, it's one page,
Paragraph.
sure, paragraph.
Yeah,
And it would, in an ideal world, it might trigger someone to think, oh, that's a really good idea.
It's consistent with the choose your own adventure, like if you're gonna build a road, if you're gonna build a building, here are your options, you have 6 to choose from, so all of the other ones, we have 6 to choose from, but with roads, we don't. So maybe
we don't have this type to choose from,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's, if I could just chime in here, though, it's not really a thoroughfare. It doesn't provide for, particularly if it's pedestrian boulevard, it doesn't provide for vehicles, so it's not really a complete street. What it characterizes itself more as is as a civic space, and we removed all the civic spaces.
But you have to accommodate the Church Street is full of delivery trucks in the morning until like 7 in the morning.
Yeah,
So it is.
until 10.
It is a thoroughfare it has emergency police cars on it, I mean.
But it's not accessible to the public to drive, as any other street. So I don't believe that it really meets the definition of a public thoroughfare.
Right.
Particularly as a complete street. But I'm not saying it's not a really cool thing. But it's more of a civic space than it is a thoroughfare.
We might be able to find a different definition to make it. I mean, I hear you, David, that you have some boundaries and ways of thinking about it that make a lot of sense historically, but if it is something that we need to revisit outside of that definition, we might need to do that, is what I'm hearing.
Well, so that was just an example of items from the chart or items in the red line that still to me seem like they need to be, I don't know, edited, but they don't to me don't warrant like a whole discussion. So those were my buckets, were setbacks, frontage types, comments, which would include your comments on purpose, parking, and I don't know, maybe Ally's needs a discussion, and then simplifying the language. And I think your question about illustrations is a good one, because we've heard illustrations are really great, they're really helpful, and then we've also heard illustrations create a bias. And maybe we should have no illustrations at all. And I don't know. That question's been lurking in my mind for a while. Okay, we need to finish.
Yes.
So is that a good enough closure of that topic?
Well, I have a long list of things
Too
to
long.
follow up on.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
So we don't need to get it perfect, but we definitely want to get it good enough that this group is willing to forward it to the select board. Okay, back to you, Chris. Do you have anything that you want to report to us?
I'll just give a quick update if you want to go to the next slide. So in terms of the Leahy grant, a big thank you to Wendy. We've been interviewing some interns, potential interns. I think we have some really strong candidates. We've got one more interview tomorrow. I'm hoping by the end of this week, early next week, we'll be able to make an offer and get that nailed down.
Great.
So
Thank you.
I don't know if you wanted to say anything about.
Oh, it's just it was a great day.
Yeah, it really was a good day.
Yeah, very enthusiastic. And some of the candidates have really skill sets and passion and interest that would be a great asset. So I'm very excited.
Yeah. And then the other, just for the future land use map, there's really not much of an update on this, because I think we've already given an update on the first working group session that we had, where we looked at identifying some potential transition zones and maybe extending the village center up Old Pump Road, just the other side of Brown River. And we have provided some additional information to CCRPC to back up what we were recommending. So the timeline is still that CCRPC will release the draft, the regional feature land use map early next week. And then we'll be bringing it back to the planning commission for formal comments. We'll have another working group meeting sometime in late March, and then it'll be coming back in April and ultimately to the select board.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's all I've got.
Okay, any other updates or sharing? Heidi?
Oh, I was just.
Did you
gonna say
forget?
that right before I came here, I went to vote. And there were some folks who were outside collecting signatures to expand the select board. And I know that was something that we as a planning commission had put into the town plan, that there would be a consideration of whether that would be something that the voters wanted to do. And it appears that there are enough signatures as of the closing of the polls today.
Yeah.
That's good news. Thank you. Okay, March 18th. Do we know what our agenda might be?
Well, I think we're going to be talking about section 13 again.
Yeah.
So we'll be coming back to that. I think that's all we have on the agenda for now. I think I'll have to go back and look. We might be talking about future land use map.
Okay. Anything else? Who wants to make a motion to adjourn?
Let's stay.
Wendy, thank you. Second to adjourn. Sabina, all those in favor of adjourn, say aye. Aye.
Was opposed.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. You guys are real like heroes for sticking.